we are not just what we see in the mirror when we look in the mirror. We are also, in a sense, realized. Now, for the anarchist, in their conception of the relationship between individuals and states, the anarchists have decided. I'm going to wait for this donation to go.
Based.
Thank you, Morlock.
Ches people killed 2 black men and said it was for law and order, so there is your heuristic for fascism.
Yeah, I mean, it goes way deeper than that. Now, let's talk about the metaphysical basis of anarchism and how it's the same as liberalism. Namely, the thing that unites someone like Hobbes, John Locke, and Proudhon, and God, whoever the fuck else, right? Godwin, whatever you want, Bakunin, the anarchists, is that the individual substance, the material individual, or I should say the empirical individual, is the object somehow of statehood. Meaning states are merely derivative of definite relations between individuals. However, these relations between individuals are not themselves material. I'm going to quote to you something from Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. So, what Marx says about all hitherto materialism, the materialism that's the foundation of both liberalism, anarchism, and necessarily by extension fascism, he says, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. So what is he saying? He's basically saying that this older materialism only conceives objectivity, let's just put it in that way, objectivity or reality in the form of some kind of atom, some kind of one-sided object, some kind of self-enclosed thing. It doesn't actually conceive things like labor, like activity. It doesn't conceive things like material relations, relations between individuals to themselves be material. But intuitively, this is a pretty shocking thing to say. How could relations between individuals be material? We can't measure relations. There's no tangibility of relations. Individuals, after all, are the tangible things in actual reality that we can sense and we can measure and can just be tangible, right? So how could their relations themselves be material? How can material relations and this is, by the way, going to define why Marxism and anarchism are fundamentally incompatible. And we're going to talk about why in the West this has not dawned on people yet. But this is going to define why they are fundamentally incompatible. Marxism and anarchism are fundamentally incompatible because within Marxism, objectivity does not mean a form. Objectivity is not a form. Objectivity is the dialectic unity of form and content. So, what does it mean for relations to themselves be objective? It means this. By the time that we enter the world and can measure it as conscious beings that can cognize things and objects like this water bottle, by the time that I am consciously aware in the world and can cognize this water bottle, it's already too late. I have already been defined materially. My true material cause has already preceded me. But the arrogance of modernity is this assumption that when we cognize an object like a human individual or a water bottle of some kind, we have arrived at the very essence of material reality. But for Marx, this ability to differentiate and make the world intelligible into different objects itself presupposes relations that are material. The scandalous insight of Marx, which is so difficult for Western brains to understand. The Eastern brain understands this very well. Russians, Chinese, Middle East, they all understand this. And I'm not saying before, how are you talking about race stuff? No, I'm saying the mind. I'm not saying for a racial reason. I'm saying for a cultural reason. The Western mind can't comprehend this for the simple reason that the scandal sounds like an absurdity. Marx is basically saying relations between people precede the way in which those relations become apparently tangible to us. You know what that fucking means? It basically means a relation precedes the way that relation actually exists in reality. It means, for example, the relation somehow between capitalist and proletarian somehow has a reality even before there are any capitalists or any proletarians. This sounds like an absurdity. But this is the only meaning of the materiality of a relation. Relations to production can only be material insofar as they somehow possess primacy in relation to their actual existence, to their actuality, and finally, to the way that they are apparently and phenomenally intelligible to us. For Marx, and the reason why for Marx is simple. Our labor in relation to nature somehow precedes our consciousness. Now, someone would hear something like that and be like, you know, that's technically not true because all labor presumes a form of consciousness, right? But the reason it's true, according to Marx, is that somehow we are always already doing something in reality before it makes sense to us. Or better put, before we can cognize that into any kind of form. And it kind of does make sense if you do believe that we come from the animal kingdom. I mean, animals are just doing shit, right? And yet somehow, they don't need to think about it. They don't need to cognize it. It doesn't need to be conscious. So there has to be some point in the continuity of the transition from animal to man where we inherit this kind of doing that is over and against any kind of consciously cognizable form. And I don't want to veer off too much, but this is something Freud would describe as drives. He would describe this as our drives, right? As our id, our ID, right? But Marx is basically saying the same thing. I mean, he's not saying we get animal instincts from the animal kingdom, but he's just saying that before we are in a world of consciousness and of consciously cognizable forms, we're doing something already. And this is also, I would argue, the dreamlike world of the unconscious. Now, if you ask an Aborigine in Australia what their origin story is, what do they say? They say something pretty interesting, don't they? They say, dream time. That in the past, in our ancient history, in our primordial mythological history, we dwelt in something called dream time. So this strange limbo place of dream time, that is the origin of humanity. That is the adobe of material relations that only then later become cognizable as definite forms by our consciousness. So I'm not saying it's neither that, on the one hand, we're animals who have the instinct to do certain kinds of labor, and it's also not, on the other hand, that our labor is premised by consciously cognizable forms of thought. It's somewhere in between It's somewhere in between this strange dream time, this limbo-like state of the unconscious, where we somehow find ourselves doing things. We can't explain why. We can't ground that in a reason that's cognizable to our thoughts. That doesn't mean our minds aren't actively involved in it. It just means that that takes precedence, right? Think about your dreams. Think about when you're sleeping and you literally dream. I mean, something is clearly going on with your mind, right? But as Freud would put it, it's the fulfillment of an unconscious wish, right? It's not really happening according to what you want to happen or what you think should happen or what you're, you can understand there's a difference between dreaming and living in reality, right? So dreaming should give you an idea how consciousness, how the mind, yes, it's an indispensable part of our ability to engage in labor. After all, Marx said that the thing that differentiates man from animal is our ability to raise up the object of labor in our imagination and realize it accordingly. But this should not be taken for some kind of rationalistic consciousness, is my point. Because I want to remind everyone, and I want you to continue to pay attention here, in case you're following me, this is the fundamental distinction between anarchism and Marxism. Taking it back, right? Taking it back to our original thing. For anarchism and liberalism and fascism and whatever else, the material thing is always already latent with its phenomenal form. So when I'm talking about something that's material, I'm talking about something that already somehow apparently and phenomenally exists just outside of my consciousness, right? It's just like this water bottle. I'll throw this at the other side of the room and I know it's there, it's tangible. But the paradox is that I only know that because I saw it first. How do you know something's tangible? It's like the thing about subjective idealism. How can you know things are real without having always already made them cognizable to your mind, right? Does anything exist outside of your mind? Well, the way Marxism resolves this contradiction, specifically Lenin, is basically that it's a false dichotomy because while our mind plays a vital role into giving form to things in our thoughts, the thing, the phenomenal form, or the thought of the thing is not actually there. We have to play an active role of doing that. So that means for Marxism, materiality is content. It is the content of the dialectic relation between form and content. It's the content, not the form. Form belongs to the sphere of thought. So for Marxism, materiality means content. It doesn't mean some deeper form. Form is something on the surface. There's no deeper form. Form only becomes form, which is something that has a beginning and end, through consciousness, through thought. Marxism and anarchism are not mutually exclusive. You are fundamentally retarded in your head. You are mentally fucking stupid. I cannot understand how you just listened to what I fucking said and would be so fucking stupid to type that in my chat. How are they not mutually exclusive when for Marxism, objectivity is precedent to form? You know what that fucking means? That means the state is not some arithmetic relation of tangible individuals. It means the materiality of statehood precedes its tangible form. It means the object of statehood, the materiality of statehood, is precedent and primary before its existence and its tangibility. That fucking means that for Marxists, the state is objective, not voluntary, not the result of some oppressive structure, some scam that, oh, I want to oppress you. That's what. No, that's not the basis of the state. For Marxism, the state, again, is derivative of class relations to production. For anarchists, the opposite is true. The state begins from an arbitrary individual elevating themselves over all other individuals, when before there was a state of nature and somehow we were all atomically separated, and it takes a state to basically force us through violence to be in association. And if it wasn't for that state, it would just be based on voluntary communal relations, wholesome communal relations, yada, 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 yada. Either way, you have the same premise. You have the same metaphysical premise of anarchism, whatever form it takes. The state being a result of human social relations is a cornerstone of anarchist critique. Hey, you dumb fuck Chaz, you stupid bitch. What anarchists mean by social relations are tangible relations of power. They do not mean the same thing Marx means, because for Marx, a social relation is antecedent and primary before its phenomenal apparency and even before its existence. You stupid fuck. So when you say social relations, you're referring to a guy with power having power over someone else. It's this like Foucauldian arithmetic where I have more power than you. My power is subtracted by your power. It's like this like arithmetic of different agents having different levels of coercive power over one and another. This is your dumb Foucauldian bullshit, which is, by the way, the basis of almost all contemporary forms of anarchism, especially in the United States, is that fucking pedo bastard scum Foucault. Everyone, I want you to spit on Foucault right now. Spit on Foucault right now for me. Spit on him for me. Spit on that fucking pedo bastard Foucault. Right? Because that's what they're talking about. We're spitting on his fucking grave. Everybody spit on his fucking grave. Press S to spit on fucking Foucault's fucking grave. Finally. Getting to what I actually wanted to talk about. The reason why this means anarchism and Marxism are fundamentally irreconcilable is because Marxism responds to modernity, to the contradiction of modernity that gives rise to anarchism and which is given expression by liberalism. Anarchism is responding to it, liberalism is realizing it, right? Basically has to do with the fact that within Marxism, the negation posed by modernity, the negation, is a moment of positive material being. What does that mean? What does that mean? Marx looked at, principally in the form of modern philosophy first, the way in which form, in the form of thought within philosophy, was being raised above and over the whole of reality, basically positioning itself as the form of a negation. I, for example, am Hegel. I am Hegel and I arrive at these mighty insights of thought. But then, Hegel's pupils will look at me, and I'm Hegel, remember? And they say, but here's the problem. Your mighty insights of thought are in contradiction with the reality, right? So somehow, as a result of this contradiction posed between the insights of philosophy and the reality before us, we have to say the reality's wrong, the philosophy is correct. And what this does is basically give rise to all of these stupid fucking young Hegelian trends, which Marx spent his time, along with Friedrich Engels, shitting on. Like people like Stirner, who came to the conclusion that, the individual ego is the only real thing. All of the ways that reality is trying to tell us, hey, dumb fuck, you're not just a fucking individual. There's things outside of you. Stirner's like, oh, that's just a spook. Because there's no way for that to be mediated outside of our heads. That means there's nothing. It's like the solipsism, right? The Stirnerite solipsism. Then you had these other dumb fucks like Bruno Bauer, right? And the rest Then you finally have Feuerbach, who finally says, okay, there is something beyond thought, and it's humanity. But then even for Marx, he's saying, but your humanity is still an ideal of a humanity that has defied religion and has defied philosophy even. That's still an ideal. That's not even the real one yet, right? Because for Feuerbach, if mankind has not awakened to his true consciousness, all the worse for mankind, as Marx put it, right? If man does not find his essence in agreement with his existence, so much worse for him. This is like ad verbatim what Marx said in the German ideology, in his critique of Feuerbach, right? So what Marx does, more or less, is he looks at this general negation posed by modernity to reality, here in the form of philosophy. And he says, while this is real, it is merely a moment of positive being. And for Marx, he names this positive being. He names this positive being as humanity. But in contrast to Feuerbach, Marx names this humanity as the proletariat. Marx says the proletariat is the ingenious soil of the people. So what does that mean, the ingenious soil of the people? Marx, the proletariat is the truth of humanity. Why is the proletariat the truth of humanity for Marx? Because for Marx, the proletariat is the result, the remainder of what humanity is after it has underwent the process of this modernistic, abstract negation. The remainder, this pound of flesh, Shakespearean terms, that remains, is the proletariat. It has gone through the process. To quote Marx, it is the complete loss of man in the face of abstract and negative modernity. So it is the class that can only find its salvation in the complete re-winning of man. Why am I telling you all of this stuff about the proletariat and yada 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 and philosophy? Because the anarchists respond to that same problem Marx did in a completely different way. The anarchists say there's a contradiction between the abstract negation and some kind of reality. So the anarchists respond to this by saying this negative abstract reality, this impression of the negation onto our consciousness is itself the real thing. That is the object. So for Marx, the proletariat is the object. Why? Because the proletariat is a semblance of positive being, which reconciles the negation. For the anarchist, only the negation is the object. You see how different those two viewpoints are? You see how fundamentally different their implications are? Because for Marx basically he awakens some kind of Eastern modernity where we can reconcile the abstraction of modernity with our particular humanity. Not just in terms of the proletarian class, but also in terms of different civilizations, different nations, different peoples, different cultures, different religions, different traditions. All of these things can find some resolution in the aftermath of the way in which modernity wipes them clean. Something positive can reemerge, which reconciles them. But what does the anarchist say? All of those things I just mentioned to you, humanity in all of its determinate expression is just bullshit. It's just negation. It's all a mask of anarchy. Anarchism is the truth. No state. There's a nothingness of statehood. There's a nihil of statehood. This is how anarchists respond to the same problem. Completely different aesthetic. Aesthetic is the most important thing, by the way. It means the deeper sense we have of reality. Yes, it's a denial of the reconciliation. It's what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness. Now, what is the unhappy consciousness? It's basically more or less TLDR. It's when you get stuck in the second term of the dialectic. Have the positive, whatever, affirmation, negation, and then negation of negation is the third thing. Anarchists are stuck in the second. So it is in this sense that I identify anarchism with fascism. Because both anarchism and fascism are stuck in this second term, this unreconciled negation. Now, specifically how that is, I'll explain it. Now, specifically in regards to the state, though, what are the implications? So the first form for Marx, when he discovers the proletariat as the truth of humanity and the true object, the true symptom, as Lacan put it, of the world in which he lived, he basically was admitting to the fact that somehow, all along, this was our cause. This was our true material reality. But this material reality didn't just exist in a self-subsisting way outside of our consciousness. Our consciousness, what was happening within our consciousness, within the development of German idealism, yada, 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 and in all of world history by extension, but specifically within German idealism, this consciousness basically participated in the development of the object in reality. So the object didn't just exist selfishly and by itself as an atom. Our very journey within philosophy and so on is the very development of that object in reality. So what does that mean? What is the basic implication? The basic implication is that for Marx, material reality does not come at the expense of the overt, apparent, and superficial forms, which are nonetheless not reducible to it. Rather, form participates actively in its own content. It means there is no anarchic substance of the state, like as Hobbes would put it. The state participates in the development and realizes its own material object in its own superficial, and overt form. There's no true form of the state. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The form of the state is the realization of its material object. That is the Marxist view. That is why Marxists can say the absurd thing that relations to production precede materially their phenomenally apparent form. The relation is more true than the apparent form. Why? Because the relation represents the essence of the apparent form. For example, a relation, I'm going to teach you a secret. Relation between proletarian and capitalist. Is that relation what goes on the factory floor? No! The relation exists before anything happens on the factory floor. The relation doesn't exist. The relation is real and material even before any capitalist hires any proletarian. Now, it's improbable that that would be the case, but essentially speaking, the relation is primary. Why? Because the relation is not referring to some contractual, conscious relation between individuals. It's not referring to a relationship created by individuals. The relation is referring to contradictions within the way our individuality is defined in the first place, particularly in the form, in this case, of the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state, for example, realizes some universal society, some universal community, which every individual is an equal and all are equal before the law, yada, yada, yada. And then we are all citizens, universal subjects of the state, where there's no distinctions in caste or privilege, yada. That alone creates a capitalist relation. How? Moreover, how that arises, we're going to get to that as well. But only from this perspective we can understand relations of production. Why? Because the question is then posed, and I've said this before, our very formal universal equality gives rise to a relation where some sell the produce of labor while others sell labor itself. Labor as such. So you can derive the capitalist relation even before there are any apparent capitalist relations from a deeper material reality. And this reality is unconscious, it's material, and it even precedes the universal form of the state itself. It refers to the definite, furthest threshold by which men and women are able to relate to their own universality, not only in the sphere of consciousness, but as such.
Based.
Thank you, John.
Material relationships exist before we are able to recognize its forms.
Precisely.
Is that what Stirner doesn't realize about the state?
It's part of it.
Based.
Thank you, Morlock. Appreciate
Is
you.
anarchism the infantile stage before actual idealism?
Yeah, it really is. And we're going to get to that, actually.
Based.
Love from the dive.
How Giovanni Gentili is the most consistent anarchist of all. But I appreciate all your donations, guys, so much. You guys are keeping the streams going. You're making it full-time and sustainable and making sure we can have more of these. So everybody, for the people who are carrying the stream, thank you guys so much. I'm super grateful to you guys.
Do you believe the conspiracy that Stirner was Engels' spook? Smiley face.
No, I definitely don't. But anyway, let me continue, okay? Let me continue. So what that means is that anarchists and Marxists, again, to recap, have a very different understanding of what the state is. For anarchists, the state represents the arbitrary power of some individuals over other individuals, which is called society. So for anarchists, the state is the arbitrary power that exists according to the exertion of some wills over other wills, right? But for Marxism, the state is not an arbitrary elevation of some will over other will. The state, rather, realizes in its form the highest extent to which, on a material level, men and women enter into definite social relations. So for Marx, the state represents something materially objective. The material objectivity being objective relations to production. Relations that are not premised by arbitrary exercise of some wills over other wills, but relations which define the highest threshold by which mankind relates to its own otherness and its own universality. What am I? We can ask this question on a conscious level and shoot the shit with answering it. But before we ask the question, what am I am being defined in a way that relates me within what Lacan will call a chain of signifiers that define the relationship I have in material reality to all others. We are not just what we see in the mirror when we look in the mirror. We are also, in a sense, realized in our social whole. In our social whole. Now, in the West, we have to contrive very complicated theories and ideas in order to understand this. But in a country like China, or a country like India, or anywhere outside of Europe, for that matter, that an individual is defined by being a part of a greater social whole is, from a civilizational perspective, it's a given. It's naturally given. It's intuitively given. For them, it's common sense. I have to present it to you as a theory. But in Eastern civilization, it's given. An individual is part of a social whole, even if that social whole is not individually tangible. So this is the Marxist view. That is the simple Marxist view. And Marx, the difference between Marx and let's call it Eastern thought, all hitherto Eastern thought, which made sense of man's insertion into the social whole, Marx establishes a science of sociality. What does that mean? In the Eastern society, we naturally and intuitively insert our individuality within the context of a greater social whole. We are a part of something bigger. But that is only cognizable to us through some kind of mystical, mythological, yada 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 type of way, which can easily veer into the territory of superstition. The state has divine origins. As a matter of fact, the state is the realization of divinity on earth. From the oldest civilizations, this is the view, where it doesn't matter geographically, by the way. Marx says no. We cannot make reference to some external thing to make sense of how we are part of a greater social whole. Because the way we are part as individuals of a greater social whole is defined by the material relations to production within that social whole. Now, the production of what? The production of human beings. The production of our means of subsistence, of our way of life. Not just people think economics and they just think, something crude. No, it's our way of life. It's how we subsist, how we enter into some kind of relationship to nature, how we transform nature in a way that reproduces us in some kind of way, that allows us to subsist, that allows us to live. So Marx is different, and this is his Western Enlightenment inheritance. He refuses to superstitiously conceive of sociality and the social whole. He elects to possess a scientific understanding of this. And what that basically means is it's something knowable to us in some kind of way. Now, I'll give you an example of how this is knowable to us. Because a lot of people make the mistake, some interpretations of Marx, like Lukács, right? According to which sociality is knowable to us. Basically, it exposes it fully and nakedly to modern scientific consciousness. Yada, yada, yada. This is wrong. Even if something is knowable to us, doesn't mean it's an object of technological domination. Knowability also means possessing the necessary political insight. For example, this type of science of the social whole was an indispensable part of the wisdom of Stalin, for example, to engage in the collectivization of the countryside. Why? Because Stalin understood that these relations to production that permeated the countryside, which are leftover the Stolypin reforms, were holding back industrialization. So this science of Marxism-Leninism it also has practical implication today in China. They understand in China, for example, that the form of small-scale agriculture is no longer sustainable, but it is socially the foundation and the fabric of Chinese civilization. So its essence must be distilled somehow and must be replaced. And how is it being replaced in the Xi era? It's through the poverty alleviation campaigns and the shift from small-scale agriculture, from being the mainstay of the Chinese economy, of the Chinese people, I should say, to, for example, real estate, small-scale apartments, homes people can own and rely upon. Also, various state benefits, yada, 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 various forms of entitlement to production through the form of the state, yada, 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 securities, yada, yada, yada. So, this specific science discovered by Marx does not nakedly reduce all that is holy and sacred to some kind of illusion. It's still something real, right? Doesn't, in this Philistine way, reduce relations between people to this mechanical, technological relation as the object of modern science. We are able to preserve the, let's just call it oceanic depth of the way in which we relate to society and to humanity within definite and particular civilizations, with all of the literary and poetic and spiritual implications that come to that. All of this is preserved. It's preserved and even brought to new heights. It's just no longer mystified and obscured, where definite knowledge is called into question. We understand that in order to reproduce our particular human sociality and our social whole, it is necessary to have a science of humanity. Science does not mean reduce to knowledge. It means understand in order to navigate, to make the correct decisions, to make the correct choices as a head of state. There have not been statesmen as brilliant and insightful as those of Xi Jinping, of those as Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. These represent a return to true Asiatic statesmanship, which requires a definite kind of science. A definite science of humanity, a definite insight and wisdom, which is only made possible now by Marxism and Marxism-Leninism in particular. So, to recap, the anarchist sees the state as completely meaningless, completely anarchic, representing only the exertion of some arbitrary will over others. Moreover, society is just the sum total of individuals. Now, where does fascism enter into this? Anarchism arises. The general phenomena of anarchism only arises where some kind of stance between the individual on the one hand and society and state on the other hand produces this position of negation. After all, it's that very contradiction that gives rise to anarchism. The state legitimizes itself with law and order and crown and myth. But I'm the anarchist and I know the truth! It's all bullshit! Why is it all bullshit? Because of some kind of contradiction between the way the state justifies itself and the real state, whatever that may so happen to be. The veneer of civilization and statehood and religion and all the ways it justifies itself and the reality. This contradiction defines the aesthetic of anarchism.